There are men who survive war, only to nearly die beneath a frozen lake in total silence. There are dogs who do more than save a life. They pull a soul back from the place where it was ready to let go. When a former Navy SEAL follows his four-legged companion into the deep winter woods, he does not just uncover a buried secret. He uncovers the truth about himself. A missing ranger, a silent town, and a dog who never stopped carrying the promise of a man who never came back. But this time, the deepest wound is Matsanet the conspiracy or the blood in the snow. It is the moment a man must choose whether he will walk away again or finally stay. If this story touches your heart, tell us where you are watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more healing stories. Help us reach 1,000 followers so we can keep bringing you more meaningful stories. And now, let's begin. Morning in the North had a talent for deception. It could arrive wearing silence so pure it looked almost holy, laying pale gold over the frozen lake and the dark fir trees as if the world had decided, just for an hour, to forgive itself. The snow around the cabin held the blue-white color of old bone. Frost feathered the window panes. The wind had not yet risen, and in that thin stillness everything seemed orderly, paused, civilized. But Kyle Rowan had lived too long inside false calms to trust one. At 35, he still carried the shape of the military even in solitude. He stood a little over 6 feet tall, lean and tightly built, his strength packed close to the body instead of displayed. He had the kind of frame that had once moved fast under heavy gear and had never quite forgotten how. His face was clean-shaven, the hard line of his square jaw uncovered, his cheekbones sharp under skin gone fair and weathered by northern cold. His dark brown hair was cut short in an old military style, though it had grown slightly longer than regulation, enough to remind the world he was no longer under command. His eyes were gray-blue and watchful, the sort of eyes that did not search for beauty first. They searched for exits, distances, weak points, patterns. Then, sometimes much later, they noticed the sky. This morning they noticed Orion. The dog had been restless since before dawn. Orion, a German shepherd in the prime of working age, moved with the focused economy of an animal that wasted nothing. His coat carried a layered mix of cream, ash gray, and black, thick across the neck and shoulders, darker along the back, with the wild elegance of winter brush. He wore a black harness trimmed with a muted dark red, built more for function than comfort. Almost the handle along his back giving him the appearance of something halfway between companion and equipment. But there was nothing mechanical in the way he watched the world. His amber-brown eyes were too alert, too intent, too full of judgment he never announced. He stood at the back door, rigid, ears pricked forward, not whining, not barking, waiting. Kyle pulled on his old boots near the stove and watched him for a moment. "What is it?" Orion glanced back once, then returned his gaze to the frozen lake beyond the trees. That was enough. Kyle shrugged into his faded olive-gray tactical shirt, the fabric softened by years, the cuffs slightly frayed. Beneath it, the dark red thermal layer held a little warmth from the stove. He fastened his old watch by habit, though there was nowhere he needed to be, and no one left who would measure whether he arrived on time. Some routines survived because losing them felt like dying in smaller pieces. Outside, the cold hit like an honest thing, and it entered through the nose and teeth first, sharp as metal. Snow compressed beneath his boots with a brittle squeak. The path from the cabin to the lake had become familiar over the months, edged by pines and half-buried stones, sloping toward a shore that looked gentler from a distance than it was. Orion moved ahead, not wild, not playful, but in short, precise bursts, nose cutting across the air, then dipping low toward the ground. Kyle followed without calling him back. He told himself it was curiosity. That was a lie small enough to live with. The truth was older and less flattering. He had been trained to respond to anomalies. A wrong sound. A missing tool. A footprint where none should be. The body learned that danger often arrived as something slight, almost embarrassing in its simplicity. Not an explosion, a hinge, a wire, a silence where there should have been birds. Near the lake's edge, Orion stopped so abruptly that Kyle nearly reached for the sidearm he no longer wore. The dog lowered his head, nostrils flaring. His body narrowed into attention. Kyle heard it then, a faint metallic sound. Not loud enough to be clear, not frequent enough to be called a rhythm. A distant clink, muffled under the frozen spread of the lake, as if something hard touched something hollow far below the ice and sent the message upward in a language too weak for human hearing, but not for a dog's. Kyle stood still. The lake stretched flat and pale beneath the morning light. The snow drifted across it in thin ribbons. Nothing moved, no fisherman, no broken branch, no machine, only that small, unplaceable sound. Orion stepped forward onto the ice. Easy. The dog paused, then looked back, not disobeying, simply insisting. Kyle exhaled through his nose and tested the shoreline edge with one boot, solid. The week had been cold enough. The ice should have held. Should. He stepped out after Orion, careful, weight distributed, eyes scanning surface color, trapped bubbles, faint seams. Years ago, he had crossed worse things under fire. That fact drifted through him without pride. Memory had stopped feeling heroic a long time ago. It was mostly inventory now. Things he had done. Men he had known. Mistakes with names. The metallic sound came again. Closer this time. Orion angled left, toward a section where wind had swept the snow thin, revealing cloudy blue ice beneath. Kyle's shoulders tightened. He crouched slightly, gaze sharpening. There, a hairline fracture, almost elegant, running beneath the surface like a vein in stone. He should have turned back then. Later, he would know that with perfect clarity. Not in the grand, tragic way stories liked to arrange regret, but in the brutal, stupid way truth usually arrived. One more step, and you knew exactly which step had been the wrong one. Orion stopped. Kyle didn't. The crack sounded less like breaking than like a breath pulled sharply through teeth. And then the lake gave way. The world vanished in white shock and black water. Cold did not feel cold at first. It felt like violence, a total seizure of the body. The water closed over Kyle's head and struck every nerve awake at once. His chest convulsed before he could command it. The instinct to inhale came fast and murderous. When he kicked upward, his knee struck jagged ice, and for one blind second he had no sense of direction. Only impact, pressure, dark, light, dark again. He broke the surface with a strangled gasp. The air above the hole was no kinder. It sliced into his throat. His hand slapped at the ice edge, gloves instantly slick, fingers losing strength already. He tried to haul himself upward, but the lip fractured under his weight and dropped him chest deep again. Into the freezing water. Training said, control the breath, spread the arms, kick horizontally. Do not waste motion. Training had always assumed a person wanted very badly to live. Kyle clung to the ice and coughed. Like the sound raw and animal. Water soaked through every layer, turning his clothes into anchors. His muscles began to stiffen with terrifying speed. The cold ate precision first. Then power. Then thought. He got one forearm across a stronger section, tried again, slipped again. The sky above him was painfully bright. In some detached chamber of his mind, a thought arrived not as language, but as release. You can stop. It was not dramatic. It did not sound like despair, thunderous and poetic. It came almost gently, like a medic offering sedation, like a hand on the shoulder after a long march. Enough. No more proving. No more carrying what could not be repaired. No more waking before dawn with a dead man's name in the teeth of every dream. Elias. The name flared through him. Not memory all at once. Just fragments, a headset crackling. Snow on a different mountain. A gloved hand slipping from reach. An order that had been correct. A choice that had been survivable. And a silence afterward that had never ended. Khael's grip weakened, and then Orion hit the ice beside him. Not recklessly, not with panic. The dog dropped low, claws scraping for purchase, weight spread instinctively. There was no barking, only a harsh exhale, and an intensity so absolute it bordered on fury. Orion leaned forward, jaws finding the back of Khael's collar near the shoulder seam. The old fabric stretched. The pressure jerked Khael's head higher above the water. Khael gasped and coughed again. Orion braced. The dog's paws slid, recovered, dug. Every line of his body strained with disciplined effort, not enough to drag a grown man free, but enough to hold him from sinking lower, enough to keep his face above the black water, enough to make surrender suddenly more difficult. Khael stared at him. There was intelligence in those amber eyes, but also something worse for a broken man, expectation. And as if Orion had already decided what Khael was going to do, and would permit nothing else. Khael tried to lift his arm. It moved like someone else's. He slammed his forearm onto the ice, spread his fingers, dug for purchase. The edge bit through glove and numbed skin. Orion tightened his grip and pulled backward an inch, then another fraction. Khael kicked weakly, found resistance, shoved. The ice groaned. For one awful heartbeat, he thought it would break again. Instead, his chest slid onto the surface. He collapsed there half-submerged, half-sprawled, dragging for air, while Orion released his collar only to seize it again, higher up, and pull once more. Khael clawed forward. Not gracefully, not powerfully. He moved like wreckage washing itself ashore. A few inches, then more. Enough that his hips cleared the hole, enough that he could roll. He rolled away from the break on instinct, one turn, then another, until the solid lake under him stopped sounding hollow. He lay flat on his back, drenched, shaking so hard his teeth knocked together. The sky reeled overhead in a white blaze. Orion stood over him, sides heaving, breath clouding, one paw planted against Khael's chest, as if to confirm the body beneath it still belonged to the living. For a long time, Khael could do nothing but breathe. It came ugly and uneven, dragged through a chest that felt lined with knives. Each inhale hurt, each exhale trembled loose from him, like something ashamed. Orion lowered his muzzle near Khael's face. The dog did not lick him, did not whine. He only watched. That steadiness unsettled Khael more than panic would have, because panic belonged to accidents. This did not feel like one anymore. He turned his head toward the black opening in the ice. Thin shards floated at its rim, clicking softly together. Beneath them lay water so dark it might have been depth without bottom, absence given shape. And a moment earlier it had almost taken him with absurd ease, not in battle, not under orders, not for a cause. Here, on a quiet morning, because he had followed a sound and stepped too far. because some part of him had not stepped back soon enough. He shut his eyes, but behind them he saw the same thing. A hand lost in white air years ago, then the present dog's teeth in his collar, dragging him toward a life he had not fully agreed to keep. "Why?" he whispered, though he was not sure to whom. His voice vanished into the cold. Orion's ears twitched. Nothing more. Kyle pushed himself up on trembling elbows and nearly retched from the effort. Every layer of clothing clung to him with icy weight. The wind had begun to rise across the lake now, no longer gentle, stripping heat from the soaked fabric with ruthless efficiency. Survival returned not as inspiration, but procedure. Move. Stand. Get to shelter. Strip wet clothes. Fire. Dry blankets. Do not sit down outside. Do not close your eyes. He knew the steps, and what he did not know was what to do with the fact that for one suspended instant in that water, he had not wanted them. He got one knee under himself. Orion moved beside him immediately, close enough to brace against if needed, but not crowding. Kyle made it to his feet in stages, bent, shaking, head light with cold. The shoreline seemed much farther than before. He looked once at Orion. The dog's coat was dusted with frost from the ice. His harness strap had twisted slightly from the strain. He stood poised and silent, tail low, gaze fixed on Kyle with a severity almost human. Not affection, not relief. Something closer to command. Kyle swallowed hard and looked away first. Together they started back toward the cabin, one man stumbling, one dog matching him step for step through the snow, while behind them the frozen lake lay under the weak winter sun, as if nothing at all had happened there. But the morning had lost its disguise, and Kyle Rowan, who had survived places built for death, knew with a certainty colder than the water that something inside him had been seen. Not by God, not by ghosts, not even by the lake, by the dog who had refused to let him sink. The cabin was still ahead. The fire was still waiting. He was still alive. Yet when he reached the tree line and dared one more glance at Orion, gratitude did not come. Only a hollow, unbearable awareness that he had been pulled back across a threshold he had not realized he had been standing on. He kept walking because the body insisted. Because Orion stayed beside him. Because morning, indifferent as ever, went on shining over the snow. And because there are moments when a man survives not by courage, not by faith, but by the simple humiliation of being loved too stubbornly to disappear. By the time Kyle Rowan reached the cabin, the worst of the shaking had moved past the visible parts of him and gone somewhere deeper, somewhere uglier. His hands no longer trembled in wild, helpless bursts. They twitched in short, private spasms, as if the body were trying to hide its panic out of habit. The walk back from the lake had blurred into fragments of breath, snow, bark, and pain. He remembered the trees. He remembered the sting in his lungs. He remembered Orion beside him, silent as a second shadow. Everything else had become survival, without dignity. Inside, the cabin held the stale warmth of banked firewood, old pine resin, damp wool, and the faint iron scent of melted snow tracked in over many lonely months. It was a small place, built for use rather than charm, with thick wooden walls, a cast-iron stove, a rough table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed, and shelves that held more tools than comforts. It looked like the home of a man who had not expected guests, and did not much care whether the world found him worthy of one. Kyle shoved the door shut with his shoulder and stood still for a moment, dripping onto the worn floorboards. He should have moved faster. Wet clothes, fire, blankets, sequence, procedure. He knew that. He had repeated harsher protocols under worse conditions with less time and more at stake. But now he stood there, like someone returned from a place he had not fully left. Orion stayed just inside the doorway, his thick, cream-gray-black coat tipped with melting frost. The dog's chest rose and fell steadily. His harness, black with a dark red trim dulled by use, sat slightly crooked from the strain at the lake. His ears remained upright, alert, though not rigid now. While he watched Kyle with the same hard concentration he gave to a strange sound in the woods or movement near the tree line. Not affection, not celebration. Assessment. Kyle looked away first. He peeled off the outer layers with stiff fingers. The faded olive-gray tactical shirt clung to his skin before yielding with a wet pull. Beneath it, the dark red thermal layer was soaked through and freezing. His old combat pants slapped heavy against the floor when he stepped out of them. Water pooled around his boots before he managed to drag them off. His body looked even leaner, stripped down to skin and shivering muscle, the kind of body built for endurance and made too familiar with punishment. There were pale scars on his shoulders, on one rib, on the left side of his abdomen. Clean lines. Old stories. The kind no one asked about if they knew what manners were. He wrapped himself in a wool blanket from the chair back and crouched at the stove. His movements were practiced, but slower than they should have been, and each one delayed by a thin lag between intention and command. He fed the fire with split logs, opened the draft, waited for the orange inside to strengthen. When the flames caught harder, they painted the room in a steadier light, but the heat felt impossibly far away. Kyle sat on the floor in front of the stove because he did not trust his legs with the chair. His wet hair clung darker at the temples. His face had lost color under the weathered skin, and the strong lines of his jaw and cheekbones looked harsher now, as though cold had carved them fresh. His gray-blue eyes fixed on the fire, but not with the comfort of a man warming himself. He stared the way some men stared at hospital monitors, as if waiting for proof of function. Behind him, Orion finally moved. Not toward him. The dog circled once near the table and lowered himself onto the floorboards at a measured distance from the stove, close enough to watch, far enough not to intrude. He rested his head on his paws, though his eyes remained open. That distance did something to Kyle's chest. He did not have the language to forgive. He should have thanked the dog. Any decent man would have. Any half-decent man would have crossed the room, gripped that heavy neck with both hands, pressed his forehead to the fur, and said the words that belonged to the living. "You kept me here." Instead, Kyle said nothing. His mouth had become a locked room. The heat from the stove began to touch him in uneven waves. First his knees, then his hands. Then the ache under his ribs sharpened as sensation returned properly. It was worse this way. Pain meant re-entry. Pain meant the body had resumed ownership. A log shifted inside the stove with a small cracking sound. Kyle flinched. He hated that. He hated that at 35, after deployments, extraction drills, gunfire, blood, and all the 1,000 calculated violences the military taught men to survive, and a sound from burning wood could still hit some buried wire and make the body betray itself. The shame was irrational, but shame usually was. It did not care what had earned it. He shut his eyes. That was the mistake. Because darkness behind the eyes gave memory its chance. Elias Grant came back the way the dead often did, not as a complete person at first, but as details cruel enough to survive time. A voice low and dry with humor even under pressure. Broad shoulders under mountain-white camouflage. Sand-colored stubble that always returned too fast after shaving. Hands steady on a rifle. On rope, on a wounded man's shoulder. Elias had not been handsome in any delicate storybook way. He had been made of rougher things. 32 when he died, maybe 33 by the way grief kept counting. Tall, heavily built through the chest and arms, with a weather-beaten face, brown hair cut short, and deep-set hazel eyes that made even silence feel companionable. He had been the kind of man others trusted instinctively, which was part of the problem. Men like that altered the weight of every room they entered. When they were gone, absence became architecture. Kyle had not seen his face whole in months. Now he saw too much. Not the death itself, never the mercy of a full memory. Only angles. Snow whipping sideways across black rock. A retreat route, collapsing into impossible choices. Elias turning once, not accusing, not begging, which made it worse. Kyle hearing the order in his headset, Kyle obeying it, Kyle living. Correct decision. Unlivable result. He opened his eyes and found that his hands had tightened into fists beneath the blanket. Across the room, Orion had raised his head. Kyle gave a bitter, humorless breath through his nose. Don't. The dog did not move. The fire popped again. Wind brushed the cabin wall with a low winter sigh. Outside, afternoon light had begun to flatten over the snowfield and dark trees, draining the world of color until the woods looked like an old photograph left too long in someone's pocket. Kyle got up to make coffee because it was simpler than sitting with himself. He moved in dry clothes now. The same worn combat pants and another pair just as old. The same faded tactical shirt. The same shape of man dressed in the same practical armor of habit. He filled the kettle, set it on the stove, and leaned both hands on the counter while he waited. His shoulders were broad without vanity, powerful without display. Everything in him still suggested control from a distance. Up close, control looked more like fatigue that had learned posture. He did not turn when Orion stood. He heard the nails on wood, heard the slow approach. Then nothing. Not at his side. At his back. When Kyle finally glanced over his shoulder, Orion was no more than 3 feet away, standing perfectly still. The shepherd's amber-brown eyes held him there with unnerving patience. There was no demand in them, no plea, and only watchfulness so complete it became almost unbearable. Kyle stared at the dog, and for one strange second the room lost its edges, because Orion's posture, steady, braced, waiting without retreat, struck some hidden resemblance in him. Not in form, in feeling. It landed with the weight of something borrowed from another man, another winter, another moment when someone had stood their ground simply because leaving was not what loyalty did. The kettle began to rattle, softly. Neither of them moved. It was over in a heartbeat, but the sensation stayed. Not memory, exactly, not faith, not anything he could name without sounding foolish even to himself. Just the cold conviction that Orion had not acted at the lake like an animal improvising panic. He had acted like someone keeping watch. Kyle turned away hard enough for the chair to scrape. The spell, if that was what it had been, broke at once. He poured the coffee too strong, drank it too hot, and felt almost nothing. By evening the cabin had fully thawed, but Kyle had not. He sat in the chair by the window, wrapped in the wool blanket again, staring out at the dim line of pines. The lake lay beyond them unseen now, though he felt its presence the way a bruised man felt stairs before climbing them. Orion had taken up position near the door, not sleeping deeply, never sprawled in the careless trust of ordinary pets. He kept one ear half-cocked toward Kyle, the other toward the world outside. The quiet should have helped. Instead, it made room for arithmetic. All the years since Elias, all the versions of the story Kael had told himself. Mission, order, timing, terrain, probability, responsibility distributed across command, weather, enemy movement, the failure of seconds, the logic of survival. These explanations were not false. That was their strength. They were solid enough to stand on, yet they were simply not large enough to cover the grave. He remembered the letter he had never sent Elias's sister. Remembered starting it 3 times. Your brother was brave. Your brother did not suffer. Your brother saved us. None of it wrong. None of it enough. Eventually, he had stopped trying, which was its own kind of confession. He rubbed a hand over his face. At some point, without noticing exactly when, he had come north not only for silence, but for punishment. Not the dramatic kind. Nothing so theatrical. Something slower. Smaller. A life pared down to wood smoke, weather, and solitude. A life where if the world forgot him, it would only be finishing a task he had begun himself. The thought sat in him with awful clarity. That was when Orion rose and crossed the room. Kael felt the dog's presence before he looked up. Orion did not climb into his lap, did not nudge his hand like a sentimental creature from a kinder story. Yet he simply placed himself beside the chair and leaned the slightest fraction of his weight against Kael's knee. It was such a small gesture that it nearly destroyed him. Kael's throat moved once. He stared ahead at the darkening window, jaw set hard, eyes open and dry. You should have left it alone. Orion remained there. You hear me? The words came rougher now. You should have let me handle it. A lie again. Not a large one this time. Just a desperate one. Because Kael knew, and the dog knew in whatever wordless kingdom dogs held their certainties, that there had been almost nothing to handle. There had only been a man in freezing water, and a moment in which that man had not fought hard enough. Orion leaned once more, firmer this time. Kael let out a breath that broke in the middle. He dropped one hand at last, not gracefully, almost angrily, and pressed it into the thick fur at the side of Orion's neck, warm, real, alive, real. And the shepherd did not move, except for a slow blink that made him look older than his years, and wiser than anything. With 4 legs had a right to be. Kael kept his hand there, fingers buried in the dense coat, while the fire breathed and the blue evening deepened outside. I know, he said, though he did not know what answer he was giving. Later, when the room had gone dim except for the stove's low orange pulse, he lay awake on the narrow bed, listening to the old cabin settle around him. The cold no longer owned his body. Exhaustion did. But sleep came in broken drifts, and each time he neared its edge, he saw again not the water, not the crack in the ice, but the instant before surrender, the quiet inside himself that had opened and said enough. That frightened him more than the lake. Near midnight, he turned his head. Orion was not by the door anymore. The dog had moved closer, settling on the floor beside the bed, facing outward toward the room like a sentry on the last watch, and one ear twitched at the sound of Kael shifting beneath the blanket. But he did not rise. Kael looked at him for a long moment in the low light. He still could not say thank you, could not look directly at the meaning of what had happened that morning without feeling something raw and humiliating opening under the ribs. Gratitude was too clean a word for this. This was survival tangled with exposure, rescue tangled with accusation. Orion had not merely pulled him from the lake, he had witnessed him. And now, in the warmth of the cabin, with the fire alive and the night sealed outside, Kael understood the part that would haunt him most. It was not that he had nearly died. It was that something loyal had reached into the worst silence inside him and refused to leave him there. He turned toward the wall before dawn came, eyes open in the dark, while the dog kept watch and the cabin held them both. Kyle survived the night, but he did not return from it. The next morning did not bring clarity. It brought motion. Kyle Rowan woke before the light had fully formed, not because he had rested, but because sleep had finally grown tired of pretending it could carry him. The cabin was dim and blue, with early cold. The fire had sunk to a low bed of embers. The old boards beneath the bed held the night's chill, like memory held blame, quietly, efficiently, without needing to announce itself. For a few seconds he lay still, listening. Wind in the trees. A small settling creak in the rafters. The soft, measured sound of Orion breathing near the door. No dreams remained whole enough to name, only a residue of pressure beneath the ribs. The kind that did not hurt exactly. It simply made the body feel as though it had been clenched all night by an invisible hand. Kyle pushed himself upright. His muscles were sore in deep, unflattering places from the cold water shock and the crawl across ice. His throat still felt scraped raw. He rolled one shoulder, then the other, testing function the way some men checked weather. Everything worked. That did not mean everything was right. Orion rose the moment Kyle's feet touched the floor. The German Shepherd had the same taut economy he always did, as if every movement had been weighed before being spent. His sable coat cream at the chest and legs, gray and black darkening over the back, caught the pale cabin light in rough layers. His black harness with its dark red trim still sat on him with the look of gear that had belonged to action for a long time. He did not stretch lazily or trot over in greeting. He stood and watched Kyle with focused stillness, ears forward, amber eyes bright and alert. Then he turned toward the door. Kyle frowned faintly. "You want out?" Orion did not scratch at the wood or give the small, impatient sounds of an ordinary dog. He only looked back once, sharp and intent, then returned his gaze to the latch. Kyle exhaled through his nose. "You and I are going to have a conversation one day. It'll be deeply unbalanced." He pulled on his boots, shrugged into his faded olive-gray tactical shirt over the dark red thermal layer, and reached for his coat. The air outside struck colder than the morning before. Cleaner, too. Sunlight had not yet broken through the clouds, and the world wore that iron-gray stillness that came just before weather made a decision. Snow crusted underfoot. Pine branches sagged under white weight. The lake beyond the trees sat hidden but not forgotten. A presence rather than a view. Orion moved ahead before Kyle had fully shut the door. Not toward the lake shore. Into the woods behind the cabin. Kyle stopped on the small porch. "No." The dog kept going, then paused and looked back. That look held no apology. Kyle swore under his breath and followed. The trail was not really a trail. It was a thinning between trees, an arrangement of brush and stone and old snowdrifts that Orion navigated as if memory had laid boards beneath them. Kyle moved with the careful irritation of a man who had not agreed to the day, but was showing up to it anyway. His boots punched through crust in places. Cold air burned cleaner through his lungs than the cabin's heat had. The farther they went, the less he liked it. There was no good reason to push deeper into the woods in his condition. No good reason except Orion was not wandering. He was working. That difference mattered more than Kyle wanted it to. A quarter-mile in, the trees thickened. The smell changed. Less lake, more cedar rot and old metal. Kyle noticed it because Orion had taught him to notice where the air altered. A man could spend years training himself to read terrain. Weather, structure, threat. Then one dog came along and reminded him that the nose had always been smarter than the ego. The ground began to slope upward. Orion slowed near a cluster of birch and deadfall, then cut left so abruptly Kyle almost missed what lay beyond. A building. Not much of one anymore, but enough. It stood half hidden in the trees, like something the forest had begun to swallow and then reconsidered. A ranger station once, maybe a small outpost or check shelter. Its roof sagged slightly beneath old snow. The wood siding had grayed with age and weather, peeling in long curls. One shutter hung crooked. The front steps were warped and half buried. The whole place carried the tired posture of a man who had remained standing, mostly because no one had bothered to push him the rest of the way down. Kyle stopped dead. He had lived near the lake for months. He had never seen this. That irritated him more than it should have. Orion went straight to the porch and stood at the bottom of the steps, body angled toward the door. Kyle scanned the clearing first. No recent tire tracks, no cigarette butts, no obvious camp signs, no fresh movement in the snow except their own. The windows were opaque with grime and frost. Whatever had happened here, it was not today. He climbed the steps with care, each board answering with a dry complaint under his weight. The front door was swollen with age and cold. It opened only after he set his shoulder into it. A smell rushed out immediately. Dust, mildew, wet wood, rodent droppings, old paper, and something else beneath it. A stale, faintly chemical trace that did not belong to abandonment. Orion entered first. Inside, the station was smaller than it had looked from outside. A desk leaned under the weight of scattered files. A wall map curled at the corners. Shelves had collapsed in one corner, spilling binders and rusted hardware across the floor. Snowmelt had come in through the roof over the years, staining one wall in long brown tears. There had once been electricity. Kyle could see the dead line of conduit and the husk of a light fixture overhead. Now the room sat in a dim gray hush, lit only by the weak daylight through dirty windows. Then he saw the flyer. It had been pinned to a bulletin board near the desk, half obscured by other old notices and a torn weather advisory. The paper had curled from damp, but the photograph remained clear enough. Missing. Lucas Hale, Deputy Ranger. Kyle stepped closer. The man in the photo looked to be in his early 30s, maybe 34. Tall, broad-shouldered in the practical way of men who spent more time outdoors than indoors. His face was lean rather than heavy, all clean lines and weathered calm, with a straight nose, a square chin, and the kind of expression that suggested patience without softness. His hair was light brown, sun-faded at the edges. Cut short, but not severe. His eyes, and even in the flat reproduction of a departmental photograph, held an alert steadiness. Not flashy, not theatrical. The kind of man a town trusted to arrive when weather turned ugly and people made bad decisions in wild country. Deputy Ranger Lucas Hale had been missing for 3 months. No body recovered. Case closed, pending conditions. Kyle read that last line twice. Closed, he said quietly, and the word tasted wrong. Orion was not interested in the board anymore. He had moved to the far side of the room near a file cabinet tipped on one corner. His nose tracked along the floorboards in short, concentrated passes. Not random, not exploratory. He returned to one specific strip of space again and again, then lifted his head toward the wall, then back down. His whole body seemed to narrow into precision. Kyle crossed the room. The smell hit him there more clearly. Diesel, faint, and old. something medicinal or industrial layered over it. Sure, nearly gone, but preserved in the wood. And under that, the ghost of wet wool and animal. Orion stood very still now, staring at a point near the baseboard. Kyle crouched, ignoring the pull in his recovering muscles. "What are you telling me?" His fingers found a narrow scrape on the floor, almost invisible beneath dust. Another along the wall. Drag marks, maybe, though age and damp had softened them. Something had been moved here. Not recently, but not decades ago either. He looked back toward the missing person notice. 3 months. A ranger vanished in winter country, where stories were always eager to blame weather. That part was believable. Snow erased dignity faster than it erased tracks. Ice kept secrets with professional discipline. But Orion's reaction was not to the idea of a missing man. It was to something left behind. Kyle rose slowly. He searched the rest of the room with more care. On the desk, he found an old logbook swollen with damp pages, too blurred to read cleanly. In one drawer, batteries corroded into green crust. Beneath the window, a cracked mug and a rusted spoon. Near the back wall, a metal cabinet with one door hanging open. And on the inside of that door, almost hidden under grime, a fresh enough smear where something rectangular had once been taped, mounted, or removed in a hurry. No revelation. No dramatic proof. Just the kind of subtle disorder that made a trained mind itch. Then Orion did something that made Kyle's pulse shift. The dog backed away from the wall, sat once, only once, then looked directly at Kyle, and touched his own chest with his nose before turning back to the same point on the floor. It was such a strange, deliberate sequence that Kyle went still. No command had been given. No game was being played. Orion repeated the motion. Chest, floor, gaze fixed and unwavering. For one suspended moment, the ruined station seemed to tighten around them. But Kyle felt it not as fear, but as recognition just beyond language. The dog's behavior did not read like simple alerting. It looked like association. As though this place did not merely smell important. As though in whatever structured map lived inside Orion's trained mind, it belonged to someone. Not the town. Not Kyle. Someone else. The sensation vanished as quickly as it came, leaving only the cold room and Kyle's own breathing. He crouched again, and this time let his palm hover over Orion's shoulder rather than touching him. "You knew somebody here." The words sounded absurd. They also sounded true. Orion's ears flicked, and for a heartbeat, Kyle had the absurd thought that the dog looked tired. Not physically. Something older than that. Like a sentry that had remained at a post after the war forgot to come back for him. Kyle straightened and stepped away from the wall before imagination could outrun reason. By the time he reached the town an hour later, as the clouds had thinned and a bitter white light lay over everything, the place was small enough to mistake routine for innocence. A gas station. A diner with 2 pickup trucks outside. A hardware store whose front window displayed snow shovels, feed buckets, and Christmas lights someone had not bothered to take down. The sheriff's office sat near the main road in a building that looked like it had once been a bank and now settled for authority. Orion stayed in the truck. Kyle went in alone. Sheriff Grant Holloway was behind the front counter, speaking to a local rancher about fence damage when Kyle entered. Holloway was in his mid-50s, a large-framed man thick through the shoulders and waist, with a face built from hard winters and long habits. His hair had gone iron gray at the temples and retreating silver at the crown. A neatly trimmed mustache sat over a mouth that rarely looked surprised. He wore his tan sheriff's uniform, with the stiffness of somebody who still believed appearances did half the law's work for it. His eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, and what stood out most was not suspicion in them, but control. This was a man who had practiced being the calmest person in the room until the practice had become identity. When the rancher left, Holloway gave Cale a professional nod. "Mr. Rowan." "Sheriff? What can I do for you?" Cale set one hand on the counter. "Found an old ranger station in the woods north of the lake." A pause so small another man might have missed it. "Did you?" Holloway said. "There's a missing person notice inside. Deputy Ranger Lucas Hale." Holloway leaned back a fraction. "Old business? 3 months old isn't ancient. In these conditions?" The sheriff gave a short, dry breath that might have passed for sympathy if it had reached his eyes. "Might as well be." Cale watched him. "Case says closed pending conditions. No body. That happens more than people like." Holloway folded his hands on the counter. "Storm came in hard. Search teams ran all routes. Dogs, volunteers, state support, nothing. And that was enough for everyone?" The sheriff's gaze rested on Cale with polite heaviness. "It had to be." There it was. Not grief. Not even defensiveness. Finality, but worn too early, like a coat bought before the weather truly changed. Cale let the silence stretch. Holloway filled it with a mild shrug. "The Northwoods take what they take. I'm sure you know something about that." A neutral sentence, maybe even a friendly one to the wrong listener, but Cale heard the structure beneath it. Accept the terrain, accept the story, accept the closed door. He nodded once, as if satisfied. "Just thought I'd ask." "Appreciate that." When Cale turned to leave, Holloway added, "Best not let that dog of yours drag you into every shadow he barks at." Cale stopped with one hand on the door. "He doesn't bark much," he said. Outside, the cold struck him cleaner than the sheriff's office had. Orion watched from the truck, ears forward. Cale stood for a moment in the parking lot with the pale town moving around him in ordinary fragments, someone hauling feed, someone scraping ice from a windshield, someone laughing too loudly outside the diner. A man had vanished. A dog had found something that refused to vanish with him. And the sheriff, calm as old stone, had answered too smoothly for a question he should have met with weight. Cale climbed into the truck. Orion leaned forward from the passenger seat, eyes fixed on him, waiting. Cale started the engine, but did not yet drive. Instead, he sat with both hands on the wheel and looked through the windshield at the white road leading back toward the lake and woods. "This isn't weather," he said at last. Orion held his gaze. No wag, no sound, only that same unbearable steadiness. Cale looked away first, jaw tightening, because now he knew the thing he had not wanted to know. Whatever had been left behind in that station, Orion had not found it by accident. He remembered it. And memory, unlike winter, did not close a case just because the town got tired of looking. The lake looked different when a man returned to it after almost dying there. It was no longer scenery. It was intent. Cale Rowan stood at the edge of the frozen shore just after noon, his boots planted in old snow, the hard line of his shoulders set against the northern wind. The light was thin and pale, flattening everything into grays and cold whites, and the surface of the lake stretched before him like a sealed thought. Smooth in some places, rough in others, with long drifts of wind-blown snow skimming low across the ice. Nothing about it invited trust. Nothing about it promised explanation. It simply lay there, patient and blank, as though it had rehearsed innocence so long it no longer needed effort. Orion was already several yards ahead. The German shepherd moved low and purposeful, his cream-gray-black coat sharp against the white world, his black harness trimmed in dark red, like an old uniform detail half hidden beneath winter dust. He did not wander. He did not search wide. He followed a line only he seemed able to see, crossing the lake at an angle that made little sense to Kyle until it began to align with the place where the ice had taken him days earlier. Kyle stopped. A bitter taste rose in his mouth. The body remembered before the mind agreed to. His lungs tightened. The muscles along his back pulled hard, as if expecting cold water again. He could still recall the violent emptiness of that first plunge, the way the lake had reached up like something alive and offended. Returning to the site felt less like courage than insult. But Orion did not look back for permission. He kept going, nose angled down, ears forward, every step deliberate. Kyle followed. He moved with more caution than pride would have liked. Each boot placement was tested before weight committed. He watched for cracks, or changes in surface color, trapped air patterns. The wind scraped over the ice with a sound like whispered paper. Nothing beneath it should have been moving. Yet as he drew nearer to Orion, he saw the dog circling a particular stretch where the snow cover was thinner, swept aside by weather and time. The ice there looked wrong, not fragile, manufactured. Kyle crouched. At first it seemed no different from the rest, blue-white, clouded in places, veined with old stress lines. Then he noticed the shape under the frost. Not natural geometry, a rectangle, broad and faint beneath a crust of white, its edges softened by months or years of freezing and thawing. Beside it, barely visible, a metal ring lay embedded under ice, like the eye of a buried machine. He stared at it for several seconds without speaking. Orion stood still beside him, tail low, gaze fixed not on Kyle, but on the hidden outline below. "This is what you were hearing," Kyle murmured. The words drifted into the wind and vanished. Yet he knelt fully now, gloved fingers scraping snow aside. The shape came clearer, a hatch, industrial once, forgotten now. A maintenance access door sealed into the lakebed structure beneath the seasonal freeze, concealed each winter by nature's most obedient accomplice. Not a secret chamber built by legends. Something more dangerous than that. Infrastructure. Functional, ugly, real. The kind of place men ignored because it lacked romance. The kind of place other men used because of it. Kyle sat back on his heels, pulse steadying in the strange way it did when puzzle replaced dread. So that was the sound. Metal shifting under pressure. Something old answering cold. Orion stepped closer and touched the ring with his nose. Kyle looked at the dog, then back at the hatch. "You've been trying to show me this since the beginning." No answer, of course, only that severe, unwavering attention. The hatch was frozen tight, but not beyond force. Kyle returned to the cabin for tools, and came back with an iron pry bar, a short-handled hatchet, a coil of rope, and the kind of grim resolve men brought to things they already hated. The work was slow. He chopped through fused ice around the edges, sent sharp fragments skittering across the lake, drove the pry bar beneath the seam, leaned his weight into it, cursed when it refused. Then did it again. The cold bit through the gloves. Sweat prickled beneath his collar despite the wind. Orion stayed near but out of the way, pacing once in a tight line, then standing like a sentry at the opening, as though he understood not just that this mattered, but that it had waited a very long time. At last, the seal gave. The hatch rose with a shriek that cut the air like something waking against its will. A black mouth opened beneath the lake. As cold mechanical air climbed out of it, stale, mineral, touched by rust, old wires, standing water, and something electric long dormant but not entirely dead. Kyle angled the flashlight down. A metal ladder disappeared into shadow. Below lay a narrow maintenance chamber built of poured concrete and steel, more corridor than room, part utility access, part forgotten service spine for systems no one in town had likely thought about in years. He looked at Orion. The dog was trembling slightly, not with fear, but with controlled intensity so strong it bordered on strain. Kyle lowered himself first. The ladder groaned under his weight. The deeper he went, the more the sounds of wind and lake disappeared above him, until there remained only the scrape of boots on rungs, the muted drip of water somewhere in the dark, and Orion descending behind him with astonishing care, claws clicking softly against metal before finding each step. At the bottom was the beam of Kyle's flashlight swept across a passage no wider than a hallway in an old bunker. Pipes ran along one wall. Cable conduits lined the other. Frost feathered the corners. The concrete floor held a thin film of grime over boot marks too blurred to date by sight alone. Some were old. Some were not old enough. Kyle turned slowly. This place was not abandoned in the honest way the ranger station had been abandoned. That place had been surrendered to weather. This had been neglected selectively. Enough decay to discourage curiosity. Enough function preserved to reward anyone who knew what to use. Farther in, the corridor widened into a service room. What the flashlight found there changed the air in Kyle's chest. A bank of surveillance monitors sat dark on a steel desk, their glass faces coated in dust but not ruin. Nearby, rugged storage crates had been stacked against the wall. A folding table held maps under clear plastic covers, timber roads, water routes, old maintenance schematics, and marked corridors through forest land that would have looked meaningless to the casual eye and very useful to the wrong one. 2 charging units stood unplugged near a tangle of cables. On a shelf lay weatherproof cases, a pair of binoculars, disposable gloves, and a handheld GPS unit with mud dried into its seams. Not relics. Recent things. Used things. Kyle moved toward the table. His face, lean and hard under the flashlight's reflected pallor, gave nothing away at first glance, but the old military still lived in the way his eyes worked. They swept, sorted, ranked, connected. He had spent too many years in rooms like this, temporary outposts, improvised command posts, places where men watched first and spoke later. But this was not military issue. It was a bastard version of order, civilian equipment arranged with tactical discipline. Orion did not sniff widely anymore. He went straight to the desk. Kyle followed the dog's line of sight and found the power unit tucked beneath it. He crouched and checked connections. A portable battery backup remained wired into the system. Dead? Maybe. Maybe not. He pressed the casing. Solid. Replaced sometime within the last year, if the manufacturer sticker meant anything. He should have called someone then. The state police, federal land management, anyone official, anyone external. Instead, he kept looking, because the room itself was an accusation now, and Kyle had lived too long with accusations to walk away from one that finally had steel, wiring, and a footprint. Near the far wall hung a secondary panel with a numeric lock overridden long ago by manual access. Above it, half peeled from concrete, a set of labels marked zones and storage channels. Beneath it, fixed to the wall at shoulder height, sat a simple console with a narrow monitor and several buttons worn pale from repeated use. Kyle knew institutional hardware when he saw it. He also knew something else. Command interfaces changed by era and vendor, but hand signal conditioning. Those old silent cues trainers taught both men and dogs left habits in muscle that lasted longer than technology. He glanced at Orion. The shepherd was standing unnaturally still. His ears were pitched forward, his eyes locked on the console, with an attention so sharpened it felt almost reverent. Kyle hand lifted before he had decided to trust the instinct. 2 fingers forward, palm down, hold, an old field signal, minimal, controlled, the sort used when sound had consequences. Orion reacted instantly, not with excitement, with precision. He stepped to the left side of the console, sat, then fixed his gaze on the lower row of switches. Kyle froze. The response had been too fast, too clean, too trained. Not pet obedience, not improvised understanding. Training, and the kind that came from repetition under purpose. For a moment, neither moved. The room seemed to gather around that fact like a cloak drawing tight. Then Kyle pressed the power toggle. A thin electronic whine answered. One monitor flickered, died, then returned in a burst of static. Another screen blinked to a menu. Dust motes drifted through the flashlight beam like ash in church light. The system was not fully alive, but enough of it remained to betray itself. Kyle's jaw tightened. He began checking storage folders, fragments of logs, corrupted camera feeds. Much of it was useless time stamps broken, files incomplete, image blocks fractured by moisture and age. But the presence of recent data mattered more than clarity. Someone had used this room, not in some buried past. Recently enough for batteries to hold and file names to remain legible. One directory sat apart from the others. Archive, training/field. Kyle clicked. A list appeared. Most files were damaged. One opened. The video came to life in a storm of digital distortion before settling into shape. It showed the ranger station from months earlier. Cleaner then, the light outside still autumn-thin instead of winter-hard. A man crossed into frame carrying a supply case in one hand. Tall, broad-shouldered without heaviness, light brown hair under a knit cap. Clean jaw. Outdoor jacket unzipped at the throat. His movements had the economical steadiness of someone used to doing difficult things without making theater of them. Lucas Hale. Even through grainy footage, the man radiated competence of the quieter kind. Not swagger, not command for its own sake, the sort that made frightened people lower their voices because someone capable had arrived. He set the case down, crouched, and called softly off camera. Orion entered the frame, younger by a little, leaner through the chest, same amber eyes, same harness, though newer, and he moved to Hale at once, not merely obedient, but bonded, his focus brightening with unmistakable recognition. Hale put one hand along the dog's neck, thumb pressing into the fur just behind the ear, in a gesture so practiced it had tenderness hidden inside function. Then he gave a sequence of hand signals. Orion answered every one. Sit, hold, track, guard, return. Perfect. Kyle watched in stillness so complete it felt like freezing from the inside out. Lucas Hale had trained him. Not as a household dog, not as a park companion, as a working partner. Unofficial, maybe. Off book. But real. The video jumped ahead. Hale at the console, Hale reviewing maps, Hale speaking to someone out of frame whose voice the corrupted audio swallowed. Then one clear fragment broke through the static, low and distorted but human enough to wound. Keep going if I don't. The screen shivered and went black. No dramatic flourish followed. No convenient confession. Only silence. The quiet hum of struggling electronics, and Orion sitting beside the console, as if the years between then and now had folded into a single command, not yet released. Kyle let out a breath he had not known he was holding. The truth did not arrive all at once. but enough of it did. Lucas Hale had been running something here beyond ordinary ranger work. Orion had been part of it, not officially written, perhaps not officially sanctioned, but trained with method, purpose, and trust. And when Hale vanished, the dog had not stopped. He had continued the mission in the only way a creature built from loyalty and memory knew how. Kyle looked at Orion. The shepherd looked back with neither triumph nor pleading. He simply held the moment the way dogs sometimes held grief, without argument, without language, yet without releasing it until the human finally understood. Above them, tons of ice and winter pressed silently over the hidden room. Kyle turned once more to the dark screen where Lucas Hale had disappeared into static, and something old and bruised in him shifted, not healed, not forgiven, but aligned. Because now the lake was no longer the place where he had nearly died. It was the roof over a secret built to stay buried, and Orion, who had dragged him out of black water and then back onto black truth, had not been wandering through grief or instinct after all. He had been trying to finish what another man could not. Kyle Rowan did not sleep much after the video. The hidden room beneath the lake had changed the geometry of everything around him. The cabin was still the same square shelter of timber and iron stove heat. The trees still leaned in their long northern silence. The road into town still cut through snow and old fence lines with the weary practicality of places built by people who had learned not to romanticize winter. But now, all of it sat over a second map, one the eye could not see unless it knew where to look. Beneath the town's ordinary routines ran another system routes: storage, surveillance, men with reasons to avoid daylight. He knew enough not to rush. That knowledge had cost him years of his life, and most of the people who had once understood him without explanation. By late afternoon, the sky had gone low and colorless, the sun reduced to a pale bruise behind moving cloud. Kyle parked the truck off an abandoned logging spur several miles beyond the marked county road and killed the engine. The world outside was a long arrangement of winter grays, tall firs, old stumps humped under snow, frozen ruts, and the slanting remains of an extraction route that had once been legal, busy, and forgettable. Now it looked like something that wanted to be forgotten harder than the weather could manage. Orion sat upright in the passenger seat, motionless except for his nostrils working the narrow gap in the lowered window. The dog's posture had changed since the chamber under the lake. There was no visible agitation, no restless pacing, no uncertainty. If anything, he had grown more exact. His cream-gray-black coat looked darker in the coming evening, and the sable layers along his spine blending into the shadows of the truck's interior. The black harness with its dark red trim lay snug against his body, worn but secure. His ears were pricked. His amber-brown eyes stayed fixed on the tree line ahead, as if the forest itself were speaking in frequencies beneath human hearing. Kyle watched him for a moment before checking his own gear again. Not much. Binoculars, flashlight, knife, gloves, the old watch on his wrist, a thermos with black coffee gone lukewarm. He carried no rifle, no official authority, no backup. He was aware of the stupidity of that, and no longer young enough to mistake stupidity for courage. But he was not here to engage. That mattered. Observation first. Pattern before movement. Truth before impulse. He stepped from the truck and shut the door softly. Snow compressed beneath his boots with the muted crunch of packed salt. The cold sharpened his breath. Far off, a raven called once, then thought better of the conversation. Orion came around the hood and stopped at Kyle's side, body angled forward. Then the dog moved a few paces along the snow-packed track and halted. Kyle crouched beside him. The smell was there before it was identifiable. Old fuel, wet wood, a chemical bitterness thin enough to vanish if the wind shifted. He waited, scanning the route ahead through the darkening corridor of trees. This had once been a timber road. The signs were still visible if a man knew the shape of industry after abandonment: widened turns, drainage cuts, old tire grooves preserved beneath repeated freeze, the occasional stripped marker half swallowed by brush. But the road had not been truly abandoned. Not recently. Too clean in places where snow should have drifted thicker. Too many branch ends broken at chest height. Too little random accumulation in the center track. Used. Not daily. Not openly. Enough. Orion lowered his nose to the ground, then lifted it again almost at once, choosing air over surface. As the dog's body tightened with that unmistakable internal alignment Cale had seen before, every serious alert. No barking, no theatrical reaction. Just concentration distilled to purpose. Cale followed him up a rise bordered by black spruce and wind-hardened brush until the trees thinned enough to reveal a shallow basin beyond. He dropped to one knee and raised the binoculars. At first the place looked dead. An old staging area, maybe, where logging trucks had once turned, loaded, or chained down before heading south. There were collapsed pallets, a rusting fuel drum half buried in snow, a weather-eaten shed leaning sideways like a drunk trying to pass as sober. Then he saw the tire marks. Fresh. Not from county plows or local ranch pickups. These were heavier. Deep, broad, commercial tread biting through surface crust. Recent enough that sharp edges still held where the sun had not softened them. Kyle adjusted focus. Beyond the shed, screened from the road by stacked timber and a stand of spruce, sat two trucks. One idled. Its exhaust rose in pale pulses against the darkening air. No company logo showed from this angle, but the trailer length and reinforced side panels suggested transport built for rough freight, not local feed or equipment. Another man might have dismissed it as legal industry working unofficial hours. Kyle had spent too many years around men who hid large things inside ordinary explanations. Orion's head turned sharply to the left. Kyle followed the motion and caught the faint glint of reflective tape on a second vehicle farther back. More movement there, a figure stepping down from the cab. He waited. The man was too far for a clear face, but his outline spoke well enough. Thick coat, heavy shoulders, movements unhurried in the way men moved when they believed the land around them belonged to fear more than to witnesses. Kyle sank lower behind the rise. He should have taken photographs. And he knew that. Should have marked coordinates, left, and handed it to people whose job description included official suspicion. Yet a different instinct held him in place, because evidence was not only what a camera caught, it was also cadence, behavior, the tone men used when they thought winter itself was the only thing listening. The wind changed. It brought voices. Not clean at first, just fragments carried and broken by distance. Male. 2, maybe 3. One laugh. The metallic slap of a latch. Orion's ears pivoted forward. Kyle shifted several feet to get a clearer line between the trees. A second man came into view near the trailer. This one was shorter and broader through the middle, moving with the stiff caution of someone whose joints had begun collecting weather as a private religion. He wore a knit cap pulled low and had a beard thick enough to hide most of his neck. He checked something at the rear panel, was then climbed halfway into the truck bed and disappeared from sight. The first man remained by the driver's side, smoking. Even at distance, he carried a certain attitude Cale recognized immediately. The relaxed vigilance of men who worked around wrongdoing long enough for it to become procedure. He did not fidget. He watched the road between drags, chin lowered slightly, weight balanced. Not a laborer alone. Security of some kind, formal or not. Kyle felt Orion shift beside him. Then the dog did something that made the hair along Kyle's arms rise despite the cold. Orion pressed one paw against the frozen ground, hard, then looked not at the trucks, but at Kyle directly, steadily, with a stillness that felt almost human in its refusal to blink away. There was snow caught along the fur at his leg. His breath moved white in the dimming air. His gaze held an urgency stranger than excitement, deeper than simple alerting. Not go, not attack, not fear. Remember. That was nonsense, of course, a projection from a tired man in failing light. But Kyle felt it anyway. For one suspended second, the basin, the trucks, the winter road, all of it blurred at the edges, and another landscape pressed through Memory Mountain dark, rotor wash, a radio voice clipped thin by pressure. Elias Grant turning toward him in a corridor of noise and saying nothing because men in those moments did not waste breath on the obvious. You know what this is. You know what leaving means. Kyle looked away first. When he raised the binoculars again, the taller man had dropped his cigarette and was talking to someone now emerging from behind the stacked timber. This third man moved with the heavy confidence of ownership. He was built bigger than the others, tall and broad through the chest and neck, the kind of body that grew thick with age rather than soft. Even at distance, there was something deliberate in him, an economy that suggested he expected space to open when he entered it. He wore a heavy canvas work jacket the color of wet bark, lined at the collar, and dark gloves tucked into one hand. His hair looked dark beneath the brim of his cap. When he turned to issue an instruction, his profile showed a hard forehead, a square jaw shadowed by short stubble, and the kind of mouth that had practiced civility as a business tool rather than a virtue. Wade Carter. Cale had seen him once in town outside the feed store, one more established man folded into the landscape of northern work and local power. Carter Timber and Freight, somebody had said then. Seasonal hauling. Good contracts. Keeps men employed. The kind of local name people repeated with either gratitude or resignation, depending on who owned what debt. What from this distance, Wade looked exactly like a man the county would trust, because he resembled the county's idea of usefulness. Kyle watched him gesture toward the truck bed. The bearded man climbed down and said something swallowed by wind. Wade replied. The smoker laughed once. Orion's nose lifted, catching more of the current, and Kale saw the dog's upper lip tense almost imperceptibly. Diesel, yes, and something sharper now. Chemical. Bitter. Unnatural. Kale adjusted his angle again, moving farther behind a screen of brush until he could hear them more clearly. Route stays the same, the smoker said. Wade answered too low to make out. The bearded man spat into the snow. Not if someone's still poking around Hale's old mess. Kyle went completely still. Every sound in the forest seemed to retreat a step. Wade did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice carried the flat weight of a man accustomed to obedience. Hale went too far. Simple words. Nothing theatrical. No confession tucked inside them. But they struck Kale with a force out of proportion to volume. Hale went too far. Not got lost, not went missing, not tragedy, not weather. A boundary crossed. A consequence applied. Kyle lowered the binoculars slowly. Something old split open inside him. Not panic, not exactly rage, but that more disciplined and dangerous thing that lived underneath both. The recognition of a sentence that rearranged the dead. Elias had gone too far. Some men had implied afterward without saying it. Too committed. Too exposed. too willing to hold the line where command had already begun calculating acceptable loss. Men did not say it directly. They hid it inside policy, timing, terrain, outcome. Hale went too far. A whole life reduced to the grammar of inconvenience. The rational part of Kael reasserted itself at once. Leave. Now. You have enough. Hidden route. Trucks. Carter. Link to Hale, by spoken reference. Enough to begin somewhere real. Enough to avoid turning this into another private war. He shifted backward on the slope. A clean escape route lay behind him through the trees and down to the truck. No one had seen him. No one had heard Orion. He could leave within seconds, drive to state authorities, force attention from outside the town's closed circle. It was the right move. The adult move. The move that respected evidence more than ego. He even began it. One careful step back, then another. Orion rose with him, silent as shadow. In the basin below, Wade gave another instruction. The smoker moved to the rear of the trailer. A metal latch slammed shut with a ringing strike that cut through the woods. Kael stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. Metal in winter. A sharp sound under tension. A body remembering faster than the mind could govern it. He was no longer on the ridge entirely. Part of him had already fallen backward into another year, another withdrawal, another split second in which duty and fear had worn the same face. Yet he closed his hand so hard around the binoculars the edges bit into his palm. Then he forced the breath out. Not here, he told the memory. Not now. Below, Wade turned once, scanning the trees with a patience that made him look less like a businessman than a hunter who preferred paperwork to rifles. Kael took one final step backward into deeper cover. He did not reveal himself. He did not move closer. He did not do anything reckless enough to satisfy the ghosts clawing at his spine. But neither did he leave immediately. He stayed long enough to watch the convoy settle into practiced motion, long enough to mark the order of vehicles, the direction of departure, the timing between them. Long enough to know this was no improvised side operation. When the trucks finally rolled out, their engines growling low beneath the trees, Orion tracked them with his whole body, every line drawn taut toward the disappearing sound, while Kael remained crouched in the snow until the forest closed over the noise and winter reclaimed its old lying silence. Only then did he speak, barely above a whisper. They didn't lose him. Orion looked at him. Kael's face had gone still in the hard way it used to before missions, when emotion was not absent, but locked behind function. The northern cold sharpened the angles of his clean-shaven jaw. His gray-blue eyes looked paler now, not empty, but dangerously focused. He rose at last and turned toward the truck, waiting unseen through the trees. He could leave this place. He should leave it. He could hand what he knew to men with badges, offices, process, distance. Men who had not already failed one dead friend by obeying the wrong moment too cleanly. He began walking back through the snow with Orion at his side, the dog's shoulder sometimes brushing his leg in the dim forest. Neither of them made a sound. But the sentence stayed with him all the way to the road, harsh and small and impossible to unlodge. Hale went too far, and Kael Rowan knew, yet with the bleak intimacy of a man who had built a life around one unfinished retreat, that some deaths were not murders alone. They were abandonments timed just well enough to sound reasonable afterward. Night came early in the north, and with it came a kind of darkness that did not merely cover the land, but took possession of it. Kael Rowan moved through the timber road corridor with Orion several yards ahead, both of them reduced to shifting outlines among black spruce, old snowbanks, and the colorless ghost of the track. The trucks were gone now. Their sound had long since dissolved into distance. Yet the place they had left behind still felt inhabited by intention, as if the cold itself had been instructed to hold the shape of what had happened there. Kyle had not gone home. That fact sat in him with hard, unpleasant clarity. He had made it back to the truck after the convoy left. He had stood with his hand on the door handle. He had even opened it. The engine key had been in his palm, and the sensible road already laid out in his head. Drive out, document what he could, get the evidence to someone beyond Holloway's reach, let institutions do what institutions were supposed to do. But a life spent in and around systems had taught him something cruel. Institutions were not gods. They were weathered things, too slow, compromised, obedient to timing, jurisdiction, funding, fear, fatigue. Men disappeared in the time it took paperwork to become courage. So he had not left. Not because he trusted himself, not because he believed in some private crusade, mostly because there are moments when what a man knows becomes heavier than what he can postpone. Lucas Hale had gone too far, they had said. The sentence kept scraping across Kyle's mind like steel dragged over bone. He knew that language. It was how cowardice dressed itself when it wanted to sound procedural. Now he and Orion had circled back on foot, taking the higher ground beyond the basin to watch whether anyone returned. The air bit harder after sundown, and snow crystals skimmed loose over the frozen ruts in faint whispering sheets. Kyle's old olive-gray tactical shirt sat under a darker outer layer, the fabric at the shoulders worn soft from years of use. His boots moved carefully, but not noiselessly. No one in real snow moved like myth. The cold sharpened the planes of his clean-shaven face until the square line of his jaw and cheekbones looked almost severe in the weak moonlight. His gray-blue eyes scanned habitually, never settling on beauty for long. The North, in winter, had beauty enough to kill a man who admired it carelessly. Orion stopped near a cut bank overlooking the lower road. The German shepherd's body had changed again since the basin. He was not merely alert. He was compressed by purpose. The sable coat along his shoulders and back looked nearly black in the dark, while the cream at his legs and chest caught what little light the sky allowed. His harness, black with that dark red trim Lucas Hale had once fastened with his own hands, made him look less like a pet than a soldier from an older army, one that served without pension, speech, or forgiveness. His ears were forward. His breathing was silent. Every line of him pointed downhill. Kyle lowered himself beside the dog and waited. For a long time, nothing moved. Then a light bloomed low between the trees. Not headlights at first. A flashlight beam, briefly hooded, then shone again. Someone walking the road. Kyle adjusted his position behind the cover of brush and half-frozen earth. A second figure emerged a minute later. Then the broader, more deliberate silhouette of Wade Carter. Wade looked different at night. By day, a man like him could still pass for what the town preferred to see. A hard local employer, shoulders thick from outdoor work, weather-cut face, short beard dark against pale winter skin. Eyes narrowed by habit rather than obvious malice. He was the sort of man whose canvas jacket and heavy boots belonged naturally beside feed stores, timber lots, municipal fundraisers. But in the dark, stripped of context, he became what control had always made him. Someone who had learned that the simplest form of power was deciding which truths other people were allowed to live with. He stood near the edge of the road, speaking to the taller guard Kyle had seen earlier. The smoker. Even at this distance, Kyle could recognize the economy of the man's movements, the way he carried himself as though trouble were never impossible, only delayed. The second laborer, the shorter, broader one with the beard and weather-stiff gait, moved back and forth between the trees and a parked utility trailer almost hidden by brush. No trucks this time. A cleanup detail, maybe. A retrieval. Something too small for the convoy and too important to trust until morning. Kyle listened. Snatches of conversation reached him only when the wind granted permission. A complaint about timing, something about weather, something about the sheriff not wanting extra noise. Wade's voice stayed low and clipped, every answer cut to size. He did not waste words on men he expected to obey. Kyle should have withdrawn then. He already had enough to support suspicion, enough to justify taking it beyond the town. Staying risked exposure without proportionate gain. He knew that. Knew it with the hard mathematical certainty training had once built into his bones. But he was also close enough now to see where they kept glancing. Not at the road. At a line of trees beyond the trailer, where the slope dipped toward an old service culvert choked with brush and snow. Orion noticed it too. The dog shifted an inch to the right, nostrils flaring toward the depression. Kale placed a hand lightly against the harness to hold him. Orion did not resist. He only looked back over his shoulder for a brief second. In that second, the night seemed to narrow. The shepherd's amber eyes caught the dull sky and held it, and for one unguarded moment Kyle felt the impossible pressure of being included in something larger than instinct. Not magic. Not a haunting. Just that stark, almost humiliating sensation that loyalty could continue after evidence ran out. That a creature without language might still know the moral shape of a place better than any man standing armed in it. Kyle's hand tightened unconsciously on the harness. "Not yet," he whispered. Orion turned back toward the culvert, trembling with restraint. Below them, Wade gestured. The taller guard headed toward the depression with a pry tool in one hand. The bearded laborer followed with a case. Not random movement, not patrol. They were retrieving or checking something hidden. Kyle's pulse slowed instead of rising. Well, that happened to him sometimes in the worst moments. Fear burned hot on the way in, then became a cleaner fuel once danger agreed to show its face. He began backing them away from the ridge. The plan was simple enough to survive stupidity. Circle wide, gain a lower angle, confirm what they were guarding, leave unseen. Simple plans were often the only kind worth trusting. He and Orion cut through denser timber, moving down and around the basin with the silence of creatures who knew silence was never perfect, and used terrain instead. Snow brushed Kale's thighs. Branches tapped his sleeves. Once Orion paused so abruptly Kale nearly stepped into him, then saw the old wire half buried under drift and wrought a remnant fence line from another era. The dog sidestepped it without a sound. When they reached the lower hollow, Kale crouched behind a fallen pine and risked a look through the branches. The culvert opening was partly concealed by brush and planked over loosely, not sealed. At a shallow cache point. Wade stood above it now while the guard knelt and shone his light inside. The laborer set down the case and muttered something Kale couldn't catch. Then the wind shifted again. "Move it," Wade said. "We're done babysitting this place." The guard answered, "What if Rowan keeps sniffing around?" Kale's spine went cold in a way the weather could not claim. Wade did not look up at the woods. He did not need to. Then he'll learn what Hale learned. Men get hurt out here all the time. The words were flat, almost bored. That was the moment Kyle understood they already knew enough about him to turn him into a forecast. He had been noticed. Maybe not seen cleanly. Maybe not identified in proof. But entered into calculation. Orion growled. Softly, deep in the chest, a sound so low it was nearly thought rather than noise. Kyle pressed his hand hard against the dog's neck. Too late. The guard's flashlight snapped toward the trees. "Who's there?" Silence followed, thin as wire. Then movement exploded all at once. The beam cut through branches and struck Orion's eyes for a split second. The dog lunged not out into the open but sideways to draw the light. Kale moved the other direction on instinct, coming up fast with a broken length of fallen limb in his hand because it was there, and because hands hated emptiness when violence arrived. "Up there!" the guard shouted. The laborer stumbled back from the culvert. Wade moved first, not rushing, just stepping clear with the cold competence of a man accustomed to crisis. The flashlight beam sliced again through the hollow, bouncing from tree to snow to Kyle's shoulder. Then came the metal sound. Not a gunshot. A tool swung hard in close quarters. Kale turned in time to catch the first strike glancing off his forearm. Pain flared bright and ugly. The guard was on him faster than expected. Heavier, too, driving with the kind of blunt aggression that came from experience rather than rage. They hit the snow together, rolled, branches snapping under combined weight. Kyle shoved upward, landed one elbow under the man's jaw, felt cartilage and breath give way, then lost balance as the guard grabbed his collar and dragged him sideways into a tree trunk, hard enough to light sparks behind his eyes. Somewhere to the left, Orion barked, once sharp, explosive, unlike any sound Kale had heard from him yet. The laborer shouted. Wade said something lost in the struggle. Snow kicked into Kyle's mouth. The guard came again with the pry tool raised. Kale saw the opening behind him then, a narrow break through the trees leading downslope to the service road, and beyond that, darkness deep enough to lose anyone who ran clean and fast. He could take it. Even bruised, even half off balance, he could break free, retreat, regroup. It was what training would once have called tactical sense. Then Orion hit the guard from the side. The impact was all muscle and momentum. The pry tool veered off course and slammed into bark instead of bone. The man cursed and twisted, trying to wrench free, and Kyle saw the next seconds with horrible slowness, the guard's elbow driving down, Orion refusing to release, the laborer fumbling at his belt for something, Wade advancing not panicked but efficient, closing distance the way men did when they expected to end something. "Orion!" Kyle shouted. The dog had taken hold high on the attacker's arm, not wild, not tearing blindly, but anchored with disciplined force. The guard smashed the metal handle downward again. This time it caught Orion across the ribs with a sound Kyle would hear for years. The shepherd yelped. Not loudly. That made it worse. He staggered, tried to keep his footing, then dropped to one shoulder in the snow. And suddenly Kale was no longer in the hollow with strangers, and winter, and bad odds. He was in another fracture of time entirely. A retreat lane, a wounded man, a route out still open, the body begging for movement, the mind already writing explanations. One side was escape, one side was someone who had stepped in because loyalty had made the choice before fear could. Elias had looked at him once, in that other white silence, not accusing, not pleading. Orion looked nothing like Elias. Fur instead of uniform, amber eyes instead of hazel, blood darkening snow instead of soaking tactical nylon. And yet the question was the same. So naked, it stripped language away. Who do you become now? Kyle did not think. The era of thinking ended there. He drove forward with a violence so complete it surprised even him, slamming shoulder first into the guard before the man could bring the tool down again. They crashed sideways. Kyle tore the pry bar free, swung once into the man's knee, heard the cry break out sharp and involuntary, and then turned and hurled the tool at the laborer's wrist, just as the older man brought up a handgun. The shot went wild into the trees, deafening in the hollow. Wade lunged in. Up close, he smelled of cold canvas, diesel, and that odor some powerful men carried. Not fearlessness, but practiced contempt. His face was broad and hard, the short beard outlining a jaw built for public handshakes and private threats alike. He struck well, not sloppily, catching Kyle high in the cheek and driving him back a step. This was not a man who had spent his life only behind desks or contracts. He knew enough about pain not to fear it in others. Kyle hit him back. No technique clean enough to admire. Just brutal, efficient damage. An elbow to the throat, a knee to the thigh, a hook that split skin at Wade's brow. The laborer crawled for the dropped gun. Orion, dragging one side now, and surged from the snow and intercepted him with a snarl that finally sounded like fury instead of discipline. "Get the dog off," Wade barked, the first true crack in his control. Kyle saw the escape route again at the edge of his vision. Still open. Still possible. Still reasonable. He ignored it. He went to Orion instead. That choice cost him. Wade caught him from behind, driving him down to one knee. Kyle twisted, took the next blow half on the shoulder, half on the back of the neck, and answered by ramming backward with all his weight until both men hit the frozen earth. The world flashed white, then narrowed. But when he rose again, Orion was beside him, bleeding, breathing hard, still between Kyle and the men below. For a suspended second, no one moved. Gun lost in the snow. One attacker half down. Wade cut and furious. Kyle shaking with exertion and something deeper than adrenaline. Orion braced on injured ribs, one forepaw digging into ice-crusted ground, ready to launch again if asked or not asked. Wade looked from Kyle to the dog and back, recalculating. Not fear, cost. That was all power really understood in the end. Somewhere beyond the trees, a distant engine sounded on the upper road, unrelated perhaps. Or maybe not. But it was enough. Wade spat blood into the snow and stepped back once. "This isn't finished," he said. Kyle's breath came ragged. "No." Wade motioned sharply. The laborer staggered up. The guard limped after him, one hand clamped to his arm. Within seconds they were gone into the dark, around the culvert, carrying what they could and abandoning what mattered less than being found there. The hollow fell silent, except for Orion's breathing. Kyle turned at once. The dog was standing because Will kept him there, not because standing was easy. Blood had soaked into the thick fur along his side, where the tool had struck. His amber eyes found Kyle's face instantly, still searching, still checking. Kyle dropped to his knees in the snow. His hands, so good at damage, went trembling and useless for half a second before they remembered gentleness. He touched Orion's neck, then the uninjured shoulder, then finally pressed his forehead briefly against the dog's muzzle, as if contact alone might hold the world together. "You stupid, faithful bastard," he whispered, and the words broke open on the way out. Orion leaned into him once. No triumph, no complaint, only presence. Kyle drew a breath that hurt all the way through and looked toward the dark road where the men had vanished. He had been given a clean exit and had not taken it. This time, when the choice came dressed as survival, he had turned toward the one bleeding in the snow. And the terrible, necessary truth of it settled in him as coldly as winter itself. Choice was no longer theory once someone you loved was the price of it. By the time dawn found the cabin, it did not enter like hope. It entered like obligation. The first light came thin through the frost-webbed windows, laying a pale wash over the table, the stove, the chair where Kyle Rowan had not sat, and the rough plank floor where melted snow had dried in muddy half-moons, from boots that had crossed the room too many times during the night. The cabin smelled of antiseptic, wood smoke, damp wool, blood, and hot water gone cold in metal basins. It was the scent of survival after violence less noble than stories liked to make it. More intimate, more tired. Kyle had not slept. He knelt beside Orion near the stove, one leg cramped beneath him, his shoulders bowed not from weakness, but from the strain of staying bent over something he could not command into healing faster. And the old tactical shirt on his back was wrinkled and darkened in places from water and sweat. A bruise had risen high along his cheekbone where Wade Carter's fist had landed. One sleeve was rolled to the elbow, exposing a forearm cross-hatched with shallow cuts and a swelling line where the pry tool had struck. His face looked leaner than ever in the dawn, stripped down to hard planes and exhaustion. The square jaw, the sharp cheekbones, the gray-blue eyes that usually held distance so naturally, all of it had been altered by a single night of refusing to look away. Orion lay on folded blankets, breathing shallowly but steadily. The German shepherd's cream gray-black coat had been cut away and cleaned along the injured side, the blood-matted fur around his ribs damp and dark under fresh bandaging. He had taken the blow badly. Kyle knew enough first aid to recognize the difference between pain and danger, between blood that looked theatrical and blood that meant organs, lungs, collapse. And he had listened through the night for wet breathing, coughing, signs of internal rupture. He had checked the pupils, the gums, the pulse. He had wrapped, cleaned, warmed, waited. Orion had not complained. That, too, worried him. Even now the dog kept one ear half lifted whenever Cale moved, as though injury had not erased duty, only slowed it. "Stay down," Cale muttered, though the shepherd had not tried to rise. The words came out rough. He had spoken little since the fight, and when he did, his voice sounded like something dragged across stone. Orion's amber eyes found him. There was pain in them. Fatigue, too. But no fear. That steadiness hollowed Kyle out. He dipped a clean cloth into warm water and wiped gently around the edge of the bandage. His hands had become careful in the old, humiliating way hands sometimes did, only when violence was over. He could reset a shoulder under field conditions. He could pack wounds, and he could do breath counts in the dark with a man bleeding into his lap. But tenderness always came harder. Tenderness required admitting that loss mattered before it was complete. Outside, truck tires ground over old snow on the road leading toward town. Kyle stiffened, then relaxed a fraction when the sound passed. Not here. Not yet. That was the shape of the morning, listening for the next blow before it came. The state investigator arrived shortly before noon. Her name was Mara Sloan, and she entered the cabin with the posture of a woman who had spent too many years being measured by men before they answered her honestly. She was in her early 40s, tall and narrow-shouldered in a way that suggested endurance rather than fragility, with dark blonde hair pulled back into a practical knot at the nape of her neck, and a long winter coat dusted with road salt along the hem. Her skin had the pale, wind-touched look of someone who worked outdoors more than her office title likely required. Her face was fine-boned and serious, not severe exactly, but shaped by restraint. A thin scar ran near one eyebrow, the kind acquired young and never explained unless necessary. Her eyes were gray, direct, and unsentimental, and they rested on people as if she expected truth to be buried under at least 2 layers of self-protection before she would get to it. She took in the room, the blood-stained towels, Kyle's injuries, and Orion on the blankets in a single practiced sweep. Mr. Rowan? She said. Kyle stood. Investigator. He had made the call before dawn, not to the sheriff, not to anyone tied to the town. Straight to the state office number he found in the battered directory inside the sheriff's own lobby weeks ago, and never expected to use. He had spoken in clipped facts. Hidden chamber. Surveillance equipment. Illegal transport route. Assault. Injured dog. Threats tied to a missing deputy ranger, and he had omitted anything that sounded like obsession and included anything that sounded admissible. Mara Sloan had listened without interruption. Now she crossed the room and crouched beside Orion before asking permission, which told Kyle more about her than credentials would have. She did not reach immediately for the dog. She let him see her first. Orion watched her, exhausted but alert. "Good boy," she said quietly, not in the bright, foolish tone people used for harmless pets, but with the recognition one professional might offer another who had been asked to do too much. Only then did she glance up at Kyle. "Vet's on the way. He was willing to make a house call once I explained this wasn't optional." Something in Kyle's chest unclenched, small and fierce. "Thank you." It was the first thanks he had meant in days. Mara rose. "Now start from the part that will hold up in court." So he did. Not everything. Not Elias, not the lake as confession, not the shame at the center of survival, but enough. The hatch under the ice, the equipment, the archived footage of Lucas Hale with Orion, the logging road, Wade Carter, the words spoken into the basin, the fight, the threat. Holloway's manner from the first question onward. He gave her sequence, timing, physical layout, possible evidence points, vehicle count, direction of departure. His old training returned in the only form still useful. Memory disciplined into structure. She wrote little. Mostly she listened. When he finished, she looked toward the window for a moment, where white light lay over the snowfield beyond the pines. "If half of this survives first contact with a warrant," she said, "Holloway's finished." Kyle said nothing. Finished was a legal word. It did not yet sound like truth. By evening, truth had begun moving anyway. 2 state vehicles, then another, then a county unit from outside the district. No sirens, no spectacle, just quiet machinery of consequence finally grinding into alignment. Mara returned once from the town, with a tighter set to her mouth and a folder tucked under one arm. "Holloway didn't run," she said. Kyle stood by the door while Orion dozed at last near the fire. "That surprise you?" "It disappoints me," she said. "Running would have at least shown imagination." She told him enough, and left the rest in the folder. Warrants executed. The chamber under the lake secured. Records seized. Carter's freight sites being searched. A deputy from Holloway's office already talking too much now that state badges were in the room. Lucas Hale's sealed notes and partial evidence logs recovered from protected storage in the hidden chamber, enough to prove he had been documenting the movement for months before he vanished. Enough to reopen everything. Enough to make silence expensive. Hale was telling the truth, Mara said, almost to herself. Kyle looked past her into the fading woods. The sentence struck him differently than justice usually did. Not triumphant, not cleansing. Lucas Hale would not rise from paper. Orion would not get back the clean health of his body simply because the right names were finally spoken in official rooms. Some truths arrived too late to save anyone. Their value lay elsewhere. In refusing the lie, its final comfort. That evening, when the fire had settled and Orion slept under the slow breathing of pain medication from the veterinarian, Kyle sat on the floor beside him and rested one hand lightly against the dog's shoulder. The rehook came in the quiet, not the noise. Orion stirred in his sleep, and one foreleg twitched as if he were running through some dream too old to release him. Then his eyes opened halfway, unfocused at first, and he made a low sound deep in his throat. Not distress, not warning. Memory, perhaps, or the body's lonely answer to having endured enough. Kyle leaned closer. For one suspended moment, Orion's gaze did not seem to see the cabin. It looked beyond it, through it, toward some vanished room, some older command, some man who had once asked him to keep going if he did not return. Then the shepherd's eyes settled fully on Kyle. The moment passed, but not without leaving something behind. Not a message. Nothing mystical and clean, just the raw, private certainty that Orion's loyalty had not been divided between dead and living. It had bridged them. Hale had trusted him forward. The dog had carried that trust until it reached someone capable of finally understanding it. Kale sat back against the chair and exhaled slowly. For the first time since the lake, he did not feel pulled backward only. Some part of him, stubborn and unwilling, had turned toward the future, not because the past had loosened, but because carrying it had changed shape. 3 weeks later, Orion could walk without collapsing, though not without cost. The limp remained. It was not dramatic enough for pity from strangers, only visible enough to hurt those who knew what had been there before. The swift, fluid certainty of a working dog built for motion. Now the left side lagged a fraction on cold mornings. He no longer launched onto the porch in one clean bound. He rose carefully, then steadied. His ribs had knit as well as ribs sometimes did, which was to say imperfectly. Breathing in deep winter air made him slower. Long runs were over. Kyle adapted without discussing the adaptation. He set water bowls where Orion would not have to climb for them, chopped wood closer to the cabin, opened doors faster, waited when the dog needed waiting for. None of it looked like devotion from the outside. It looked like routine. That suited them both. Word spread through town the way smoke did, through cracks first, and then everywhere at once. Wade Carter was charged. Holloway was suspended, then arrested, the shape of his authority collapsing faster than his face could accept it. Lucas Hale's name was restored in official language. Deputy Ranger killed in connection with an active criminal investigation, not lost in weather, not careless, not erased by convenience. People came by the cabin after that. Not crowds. This was still the North. People there respected grief most when it kept the door closed, but a few came with casseroles, awkward gratitude, questions Kyle did not answer, and the peculiar softness people offered men they had previously been content to misunderstand. He endured them. He did not become friendly. He did not become healed in the theatrical sense. He simply stopped pretending the world could not reach him. The first young veteran arrived in late January. His name was Daniel Voss, 24, recently discharged, shoulders too tight for his own age, with sandy hair hacked short by habit, and the restless, watchful look of someone whose body had returned home before his mind had received the paperwork. He stood on Kyle's porch in a thrift store coat, not warm enough for the region, hands bare in the cold, because he had misplaced one glove and considered the other no longer worth keeping. He talked too fast at first. Then, not at all. He had heard, through some braided route of rumor and veteran outreach and town talk, that there was a former SEAL near the lake who knew things about not sleeping. Kyle invited him in. Daniel lasted 40 minutes before shame got louder than exhaustion and drove him back out the door. Kyle let him go. Help, he was beginning to learn, was not the same as rescue. A second man came in February and stayed to chop wood without being asked. Then a third came only to sit by the stove in silence, while Orion rested at his feet like an old border sentinel guarding two countries at once, the broken place and the one beyond it. Kael did not fix them. He did not offer speeches, redemption arcs, patriotic slogans, or the counterfeit warmth of men who confuse advice with presence. Sometimes he made coffee. Sometimes he listened. Sometimes he pointed toward the lake and said nothing until the other person understood silence could be survived too. One evening, near the end of winter, he stood on the porch with Orion beside him, while the sun went down red behind the pines. The dog leaned lightly against his leg, not from weakness alone, but from familiarity. His coat had thickened again, though age and injury had placed a new gravity in the body beneath it. But he no longer scanned the world for motion with the old sharp velocity. Instead, he watched carefully, choosing his attention with the precision of something that had learned cost. Kael looked down at him. "Still looking," he said. Orion's ears shifted toward the tree line, toward the road, toward the porch steps, where, an hour earlier, a young man had paused too long before finally knocking. "Yes," the dog seemed to say without sound. "There. That's where." Kael lifted his gaze to the road beyond the trees, the one that led to town, to strangers, to whatever came next. The air held the last bite of winter. Somewhere far off, a raven called into the evening like a witness who had seen everything and chosen sarcasm as a coping skill. He thought once he had come north to survive. Then, for a long time, he thought surviving was all a man could reasonably ask of life. But survival, he knew now, was only the body's answer. Staying was the soul's. Lucas Hale had been named. Wade Carter had fallen. Grant Holloway had finally met the weight of his own silence. Orion had lived, though not unchanged. Kael had lived, though no less marked for it. The ending, if this was one, was smaller than justice and larger than victory. It was a door left unlocked. A fire kept ready. A chair not pulled away when someone needed to sit. A wounded dog still turning his head toward the exact place in the world where care was required. Kael rested one hand on Orion's neck, feeling the warmth of him through the thick fur, the scarred strength still there beneath all that had been lost. He had once believed winning meant coming home breathing. A dog had taught him better. Winning was not surviving the dark. It was refusing, at last, to turn your back on what needed you to remain. Here's a closing message in English you can use at the end of the story. Sometimes miracles do not arrive as thunder from heaven. Sometimes they come quietly, on 4 tired legs, through snow, pain, and silence. Sometimes God does not remove the darkness right away. Instead, he sends something faithful enough to stand beside us until we remember how to keep going. Kael thought survival was enough, but in the end, he learned that the real miracle was not just being saved from death. It was being called back to love, back to courage, back to the responsibility of staying when it would be easier to walk away. Maybe that is how God often works in ordinary life. Not always through great signs, but through loyal hearts, unexpected mercy, and the quiet moments that stop us from giving up on ourselves and on each other. In our daily lives, how many people are fighting battles no one can see. Some are carrying grief. Some are carrying guilt. Some are simply tired in ways words cannot explain. And sometimes, all it takes to change a life is one act of faithfulness, one hand that stays, one soul that refuses to turn away. That, too, can be a miracle. If this story touched your heart, please share where you are watching from in the comments and tell us what part of this journey stayed with you the most. Share this story with someone who may need hope today. And if you believe in stories about healing, faith, loyalty, and second chances, please subscribe to the channel and stay with us for more. May God bless every person watching this. May He bring peace to the broken-hearted, strength to the weary, light to those walking through dark valleys, and faithful love to everyone who feels alone. And may He remind us all that sometimes the greatest victory is not escaping the storm, but choosing by His grace, and not to turn our backs on what truly matters.